So, yeah, I'll officially register a complaint of following Senator Warner in a standing ovation, but you're glad to see us too as well, I know. And so we have a relatively brief time, and half that time we're going to make question and answer. So you're going to see history done with great efficiency here. What we do on BackStory is we take the headlines and say, you know, I bet it's got a little bit of depth to it. And it turns out that it has a lot of depth, the things that we're talking about tonight, the president and innovation in media and the press. So being a historian, we have to start with the earlier period and trace the story. So Krista, it seems to me that it must have been hardwired in from the very beginning that we're going to have this tension between the press and the president, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, Jefferson is usually on my mind, but I'm going to take a break from him for a moment and go back to your question about this assumed tension between the government and the media. And I'm going to tell you a surprising thing, and that is that at the founding period, the government thought that the best way to ensure democracy in the new nation of America was to create a subsidized press. That's right. A subsidized press.
Wow. Sounds like socialism to me.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it does.
What are you talking about? We know we fought a revolution, so we didn't have to pay any taxes to anybody for anything. So how'd they subsidize this press?
I know. So usually when you hear subsidized press, you think police state, you hear propaganda machine. But instead, the founders thought that the best way to inform the people in this far-flung nation about what the government was doing in Washington, D.C. was newspapers, to report on the workings of the federal government.
I remember newspapers. That's like words on paper. Right?
Back in the day.
Yeah, right.
And you end up with words on your hand with those newspapers.
Yeah, right.
So it was no accident that just after the federal Constitution was ratified in 1791, the next year, the government took steps to create that press.
So how'd they do that?
They did it in a weird way, Ed. They did it with something obscure called the Post Office Act.
That'll never work.
I knew you would be dubious about this, but in 1792, they created the post office network across the United States, stretching from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi. And this connected the federal government to people, everyday people, and informed them about what was going on in the federal government. And actually, by 1840, there were 40 million newspapers being disseminated. That accounted for 90% of the volume of the mail. It was an incredible amount of the mail was the news.
And Americans became famous for being voracious readers of these newspapers, really.
They did.
So how would you get them? I mean, I happen to know that there wasn't cars back then. And so,
I don't think so.
Yeah. So how would you create this network over such a vast and sparsely populated area?
That's a good question. And actually, part of that subsidy went to the stagecoach business. So stagecoaches, if you guys have ever seen like old westerns or something with U.S. mail in the window and the horses, you know, being driven down some old dirt road, the stagecoaches would actually carry that mail along with passengers to these areas that nobody had ever heard of.
So people would comment that they would show up in the middle of the woods, some cabin, and they'd be reading the newspapers, right? So it's like the press was there almost as soon as settlement was.
Exactly. So the founders thought that the best way to make sure that this technology of the new nation succeeded was through the tool of the press.
Yeah, but I happen to know that Thomas Jefferson didn't always get along with the press. I don't have like concrete
he got some bad press
details or anything, but I have a faint memory that he got sideways with some reporting.
Yeah, that's details, Ed. Well, he started off being pretty excited about the press, right? He was in France during the Constitutional Convention, and he wrote back and he said, you know, the problem with Europe is that they divided the nation into classes. Half of them are wolves, and the people are sheep. And what I want to do in America is prevent the people from being
donkeys
sheep.
and elephants, right? No, I'm sorry, okay.
And he said the best way to prevent the people from being sheep and the government from being a wolf is the creation of a free press. So he very much supported the creation of this subsidized press.
Yeah, but it bit him, didn't it?
It did, especially during his presidency, because what he didn't bet on was that the press would become partisan.
Who could have thought that?
So actually, the printers of these particular newspapers became the most professional partisans of the era. And Jefferson got really upset that these printers, he called them tyrants, essentially brought news to the people, but they delivered it through a partisan lens, a political lens, either through a Federalist or a Republican set of glasses.
So tell me that went away.
It didn't, sadly. Jefferson hoped it would, and it never did. But we have to remember that Jefferson and many of the other founders never predicted that a two-party system, would take over in the US. They thought it would be a single-party system. Jefferson predicted the end of parties in future. But actually, the two-party system ended up stabilizing the country. And I know you're an expert on this, Ed. I don't know if you want to jump in on this.
Well, you have the strange thing, and we think of the 19th century being sort of maybe freer than we became later, but every newspaper would have been partisan and labeled as such, just like everything was Fox or MSNBC newspaper, and they were proud of it, and you would get your news from that perspective, and you liked it. And in the same way that the state had subsidized newspapers early on, then political parties subsidized them. And throughout the entire 19th century, that is what the press would have been. You would have read an explicitly partisan newspaper. And some people have said that's one reason we had the American Civil War, is that people, unlike Senator Warner was saying we all need to listen to each other, people really weren't. They were hearing the same thing from the Democrats to the Republicans over and over again, and from the Northerners and Southerners, and kind of talked themselves into a civil war. And then that reasserted itself throughout the second half of the 19th century. And then somehow it changed to something else, and people decided, no, that's wrong. We need something called objectivity. So you invented objectivity, didn't you, Brian?
I don't know. That was the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be responsible for objectivity. But it is certainly true that I think the relationship between the press and politicians changed a lot in the 20th century. For one thing, political parties were not as important. I'll bet there are those of you out there that can actually remember when times were not so partisan. Certainly in the 1950s, the American Political Science Association said, you know, we need parties to stand for ideas. We need more differences between Democrats and Republicans. That's definitely under the be careful what you wish for.
Well, I heard Senator Warner invoke Walter Cronkite.
Exactly.
He just told us the truth every night. I heard him.
And actually, that's a great example of a technological change that really supported far less partisanship, because you had, well, maybe not you, Ed, you grew up in Eastern Tennessee, but we had 3 networks. We had ABC, NBC, CBS, and we had national news.
That's what all those numbers on that dial were for?
And now, exactly. You had a dial? So let's do the math, right? I don't have an MBA, but if you are one of 3 networks, you need to get at least 33% of the populace to be in business. So all of those channels, I don't mean to take anything away from Walter Cronkite, but all of those channels hugged the middle. They had a real, literally technological stake in that they were the only outlets of the media. And that is one of the reasons, there are many other reasons, but that's one of the reasons that we had such consensual politics.
And then what happened?
Well, I know we're supposed to be talking about the first 100 days.
Let's do that.
Right?
We are.
And I listened carefully to what Bill and Senator Warner were saying. It was really fascinating. And I think I heard the word unprecedented used, how many times? 10 times? 12 times? I heard it a lot.
Many.
Right? And I know that when I watch the news, which now is available through all these outlets, I know that the word unprecedented is used and applied to President Trump more than any other word. And I know that all of you know that when it comes to media, one of the things that he has done that is unprecedented is his use of the Twitter sphere. He is our tweeter-in-chief. But I think all three of us would argue that actually when it comes to presidents using new technologies, this is one area that President Trump is not that unprecedented. In fact, it happens quite regularly. And I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. Ed, you've heard of the radio, right?
I have heard of it, yeah. I've even listened to it.
I know Krista hasn't, but we didn't just get cars in the 20th century, we got the radio. Well, the radio was around in its infancy for the Harding administration, for the Coolidge administration, for the Hoover administration. It was there and it was growing. And Hoover used the radio. He used it to give speeches that he read like this, and they lasted for about 2 hours. Right? So it's not like the radio was new, but President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, came along and he used the radio in a completely new way, and he used it through the fireside chat. And what did he do? He stopped giving 2-hour speeches, and he stopped talking like this, and he spoke in a very conversational tone. People called him avuncular, and he communicated directly through the American people with the radio. And so that was one of the major changes in the 20th century. Fast forward to the television age and that one channel you got in Eastern Tennessee, Ed, and you get those famous moments of Eisenhower using the television. And how many of you actually seen clips of Ike on television? Right, a lot of you. Eisenhower, very good president, very bad with the media. The television had been around for Truman, had been around for Eisenhower. It was really Kennedy who was able to use television during his debate with Nixon to project an air of confidence, cool confidence, standing up to the Soviet opposition. And then more than Kennedy, it was Ronald Reagan who perfected the use of the video image. Reagan didn't care about the words that went along with television. What he cared about were those images. And the classic example was when Ronald Reagan figured out the television coverage, the images that he wanted during his re-election campaign in 2004. He went down to Daytona. He started the race on Air Force One. He announced it from the booth. And all of this was being covered by Sam Donaldson, who was doing nothing but trashing Ronald Reagan with his words. Reagan could have cared less. He got exactly the coverage that Michael Deaver, his aide, drew up a year and a half before. It was Ronald Reagan with blue-collar Southern voters, just the people he wanted. Now, he couldn't have predicted who would win, but Richard Petty won, who happened to be the head of stock car drivers for Ronald Reagan. I'm not saying it was fixed. The Russians were not involved in that election. And what image did he get at the end of Sam Donaldson's coverage? Critical all, he got Tammy Wynette standing next to him, singing "Stand By Your Man," right? This is pretty hard to top. So fast forward to one more quick example, and then we're going to turn to questions pretty quickly. That's this thing called the internet.
I've heard of it.
You know, I kind of end with the 20th century, but we started using this at the end of the 20th century. And you probably think that Barack Obama mastered the internet and social media for use in political campaigns. No, it was actually Howard Dean who figured out how to raise lots of money and how to organize people in the 2004 campaign. That Scream thing kind of set him back, especially when it went viral. You heard Senator Warner say, technology gives, technology takes away. But what Howard Dean figured out that he could do is connect people virtually in order to get them to meet each other. And he used a social media that was relatively new called Meetup.com. And by the time the Dean campaign really peaked, his people were the #1 users of Meetup.com. That's the good news. Does anybody know who the second most frequent users of meetup.com was? The Wiccans, witches. So
I was going to say that.
I know that you really know that. So what's the point of all of this history and all of these examples? And by the way, these technologies come along and they exist for a long time. The question is using them. And even if we go back to Krista's period, what was the technology involved? It was road building, actually.
Yeah, what was mobilization, right? How do you mobilize?
The biggest subsidy the government gave the mail was not just paying for the cost of the delivery of newspapers, it was building all of those roads. And they built those roads in order to deliver the mail. And then the question becomes, what smart politician is going to finally figure out how to use these new communications technologies for political purposes? So as unprecedented as some elements of the Trump administration are, his innovation in media is not unprecedented, although he's certainly the first to use Twitter the way he has.
So is there a trend toward Twitter? I mean, it seems to be a different thing than a fireside chat. How would you define it?
I think it is. I think that increasingly presidents have tried to figure out how to go around those political parties that you bequeathed us,
Yeah.
Krista, and that Ed, your century, the 19th century, just totally solidified. And from the fireside chat all the way through Twitter, the question has been, how can presidents communicate even more directly than the fireside chat, almost intravenously into your Twitter feed, to get around the Sam Donaldsons, the Fourth Estate, the media, who like to intervene between them and the public, and to get between, and to also get around political parties, as Donald Trump has. How do you go directly into your cell phone, intravenously almost?
Not that you should check it now, because we're very interesting up here.
Exactly.
So we've just traced a very long narrative arc. You can see that there are changes, but there are also a lot of continuities in this. But we would like to hear your questions about this. We could talk about all this indefinitely. Wiccans is a topic of...
Yes, and please direct all the difficult questions to Ed Ayers.
No, that's right. So I'm not exactly sure how we're doing this. Do people just stand up? And we have a microphone. Now I know how we're doing it. There's a microphone ready to come to you. There's a microphone on both sides. So basically, we're using new technology to amplify your thoughts.
Another wonderful 20th century invention.
And we have someone right here that I'm going to call on, and the microphone is going to come to him right now. Yes, in the plaid shirt.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for going first.
Thank you.
Yes. So it sounds like the norm may be this more hyper-partisan media rather than the past several decades until most recently, that Eisenhower and Cronkite era was more the exception. So are we doomed to go back to the more hyper-partisanship? And is there anything we can do about that?
Go ahead, Brian. No, I can tell he wants to. I know him very well.
No, it absolutely is the norm. And I think that basically Truman through Jimmy Carter, early Ronald Reagan years is very much the exception. I talked about some of the technological reasons for that structure the media, but there was another very, very important factor. That was a common enemy, and that common enemy was the Soviet Union. And the Cold War had an incredibly dampening effect on partisanship, especially when it came to foreign relations. And one of the reasons that a lot of older hands are pulling what hair they have left out of their heads is they can't understand how it could be that the country is not coming together over potential assaults on basic democratic institutions from an outside entity, from Russia, a potential enemy. That is exactly the kind of thing that the country came together around during the Cold War.
I think, too, hyperpartisan sounds so bad, but the most hyperpartisan era of American history was the second half of the 19th century, and I defy you quickly to name 5 presidents from that period, when we had the highest voter turnout, the greatest mobilization, the most loyalty to party, and we can't even think of anything that happened, right? So hyperpartisanship can actually be a stabilizing force, as it was until it became a destabilizing force. So in our own nostalgic memory, hyperpartisanship seems like a terrible thing, but it actually has been, as you suggested, more the norm than the exception in American history. Yes? Krista, do you want to say something before I take the next? Okay.
Maybe just to add on this, Senator Warner said that there's a responsibility by organizations like Facebook to not just pass through, but to potentially have a role in perhaps filtering. And so I'm wondering if you take that with your previous comment about the hyperpartisanship, or do you agree with that idea of responsibility by these organizations to, I don't know, ensure that there's truth to what they push through, or that there's objectivity, or some kind of regulatory role that they need to play?
Well, I would just say that, this is not really a new innovation, because we saw a very similar thing in the 19th century. When you bought your newspaper, you bought a partisan newspaper. You were supporting the Republicans or the Whigs, and it was very much a partisan organ. They did not feel any responsibility to be objective or to be truth tellers, right? They were sending a partisan message.
And so the cult of objectivity comes when the newspapers switch from being partisan organs to being businesses. And then, it goes back to what Brian was saying about the 30% of the audience. A newspaper, if you're trying to sell newspapers to as broad an audience as possible, and you have all this advertising coming in, which is new, then you can say, hey, but we're going to give it to you straight. No spin. It's going to be just the facts. And that's what you're buying. So I think what we're seeing today is something that is a commercial engine behind it, and we expect a commercial engine to bring us objectivity. That also sort of has historic roots. That's the way, what we think we get for giving people our attention. We'll listen to your advertising, as on Walter Cronkite, but as a result, what we get is unbiased news. So I think, TomTom is all about innovation. This is an innovation that's destabilizing. The relationship between the economic support and the end product seems to be in slippage right now.
Yeah, and I would also say, before we get too carried away with Walter Cronkite, in order to get that 33%, that mainstream media stayed away from a plethora of topics. If you want to get viewership, if you want to get white viewership in the South in the 1950s, during the Jim Crow system in the South, you're not going to run a lot of stories on the network news about racial relations in the South. There were all kinds of things that were left out of the news, going back to the so-called origination of objectivity in the late 19th century, and that covered even newspapers like the New York Times, some of the paragons of objectivity. They had very slanted coverage of lynching, for instance. They had a very biased, we would say, view of what we would say was objective history.
Almost trans-party. Right? There's things
not
we're
partisan.
not going to, we're just not going to talk about this in this entire region of the country. So I don't know if there was a golden age. I mean, people would have listened to the fireside chats and go, well, what democratic drivel is this, right?
Absolutely.
So we don't want to imagine that there was a time, except for Walter Cronkite, where these things. Have a question on this side? We do. Okay, good.
I was recently watching the TV broadcast news, and the person referred to others as the media. So I would be interested in your thoughts as to who is the media.
Who's not the media? Basically, to build on Brian's point, so we've all become the media. And literally, of course, it's the medium, but in some ways, as the last question suggests, the medium has become transparent. We don't think Twitter by itself has a point. We can use it for anything we want to. So the scary thing is that we didn't mind so much when parties were hyper-partisan, but it's now when we're all partisan and we have a voice. I mean, we all remember how great it seemed when these things first came along, and now you wouldn't have the chokehold of big business telling us what to think and see. We'd be able to do it for ourselves. And
I think a very good example is the power of the YouTube video or the power of the cell phone video. We just all witnessed the takedown, kind of a major airline because of a cell phone video. And you know, when I turned on NPR this morning, because of course I'm a liberal, I listen to Morning Edition.
You've been outed.
And when I turned on the news this morning, the top of the news was this poor man being dragged out of the airline. All of this because of video. And then, of course, on an even more serious note, we have finally a lot of attention being paid to relations between police departments and African Americans in particular, primarily because of cell phone videos. So when Ed says you are the media, that's quite literally true these days.
Yeah, and you now have police officers actually wearing recording devices, right? Yeah.
We had a fascinating episode about that on BackStory. Be sure to download all the podcasts on your phone and go back and listen to that. I believe we have another question now.
Thank you. I'd like to cut to the chase to ask you a question.
That's all the time we have for this evening.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. Keep your day job. I would like to ask your opinion regarding the media as we basically have known it most of our lives, certainly mine, I'm pushing 80. And the charges that our president has made throughout his campaign and into his presidency, that journalists, and I've been one for 50 years, that journalists are among the most dishonest people you could ever possibly find, and that the media is our enemy. My question to you is, how much of our country's populace do you think is believing this kind of thing?
I don't know the answer.
That's a very heavy charge for a president of this country to make.
It is. You know, Thomas Jefferson might have agreed.
Yeah, I mean, he did, in his retirement years, characterize the press as wolves, so.
Well, we're a history show. No, really. I mean, that's what we do, is we're providing you historic perspective. Yeah. So what this suggests that it's hardwired in, that people who feel that they are the victims of the press turn on the press. That is kind of the flip side. I don't know, Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I certainly think that if you want to talk about the last 50 years, I think public opinion about the media is probably at an all-time low for the last 50 years. I don't just blame the current administration for that. I think if you want to try to understand, and my guess is, or I hope that Nicole Hemmer, who is going to be on the panel right after us, she's just written a book about this. I think you could point to the emergence of talk radio, a form of media that described itself as not mainstream media, and the rise of Rush Limbaugh, who on a daily basis critiqued the mainstream media, calling it dishonest, saying that it was not reporting objectively. And after that, you would point to the rise of Fox News, which also positioned itself, even though it's, I think now, the largest cable news or has the largest viewership, still kind of positions itself as not the mainstream media. And so if you want to try to understand why,
what you're saying is the media
suspicious
itself that has created this.
I think that's exactly right.
Different parts of the medium.
The innovation of 24-hour news, which I think has affected this. I mean, the fact that they have to fill all these hours in an increasingly partisan world, I think, has contributed.
In fairness, I don't think you can find any institution that hasn't undergone a pretty radical decline in confidence, except historians, of course. No, I mean, and I'm kidding, because people don't trust historians either. It's hard to believe.
They trust museums.
They do. The most trusted institutions for understanding history are museums.
Museums, yeah, honestly.
Yeah. We have another question. Yes, in the back. Yes, the microphone is coming to you even as we wait. And then there's another one in the general area there too, okay?
Hi, I'm curious, so your trajectory is sort of talking about how unprecedented is an overused word in this context. Can you talk a little bit about something that you do think is actually unprecedented in this administration?
How much time do we have?
2 minutes is it actually?
I think it really began after election. I think it was unprecedented to have 2 presidents at the same time. It certainly was unprecedented for the last 40 years for a president not to release his tax returns. I think the degree to which President Trump has relied quite literally on his family is unprecedented, and I could go on and on. I think his attack, as this gentleman suggested, his attack on the media and the integrity of journalists is unprecedented. So I don't mean to suggest that people are wrong when they say President Trump is unprecedented, but I think his innovations using new technology to try to go around party and intermediary press is not unprecedented.
So I think we have maybe time for one more question. Yes, right there. I try to find somebody as far away from the aisle as possible.
Thank you. What do you think the impact of Bernstein and Woodard were on the public imagination and the importance of investigative reporting? And do you think there is still a role for investigative reporting today that can help us discern the truth?
The investigation into the Watergate scandal was remarkable for increasing public trust in the press, and by the way, decreasing public trust in government, probably a very healthy thing at the time. It had remarkable ripple effects, not just on the Washington Post, but soon after Woodward and Bernstein, we had very popular TV programs like 60 Minutes, where they were going undercover to unearth shenanigans in the car repair industry. And I cite this just to say that this questioning of institutions that Woodward and Bernstein kind of stand for wasn't just limited to high politics. It really spread through society. To add to what Senator Warner said, I think our democracy depends on a vigorous, investigative press. Increasingly, it's important that they be international, global, rather than just national. And I think institutions like ProPublica and others that support independent investigations of politics are essential to our democracy.
And I just want to end by saying this is the flip side of this decentralized, multifaceted media environment in which we're in which it can lead to this destabilization. It's also unleashed enormous energies of investigation and of connection and that sort of injection of the news into the bloodstream in other ways as well. I think the first 100 days have been remarkably dramatic, of course, and many things unprecedented. I think we're going to see this. One thing I think history teaches us is that every action leads to a reaction, and that the next stage of history is building even as we're watching this one unfold. So the good news for that, it always makes more history, which is what we live on. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.